We are grateful to the ministry and Gordon for hosting us today. And my panelists are Emmanuel Etim. Emmanuel is literally the guardian of the future, which is very appropriate in terms of today's agenda, in terms of speaking about the youth and the role in agriculture and harnessing the potential that we have ahead of us. He's going to give the keynote remarks for this session.
In 2015, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa convened a high-level conference on data revolution, data for Africa, focused on rebooting open data, and they came up with a couple of recommendations. And so I'm going to build my discourse from that conference and the premise for that conference and the issues that have come up from there, and where do we situate this discourse today, the next few days around open data, and looking at from the context of the agricultural value chain. Specifically in terms of the agricultural industry, my work within my portfolio organizations has looked a lot around youth, young people or youth-owned enterprises and how they participate in that industry. I've always argued that agriculture in and of itself is not a profitable enterprise. In fact, data shows us that agriculture itself as a practice is the least productive sector, or as it were, profitable sector in Africa's economic activity. And we saw from certain data around East Africa conducted in 2014 that most of the movements that happen in terms of labor migration were seen on the decline in the agricultural sector, with more of the activities moving to the supply chain or as it were the service industry. And so the discourse around agriculture will not be necessarily useful to young people in and of itself just because it keeps young people busy. I always also argue that when it comes to job opportunities, employment, and labor force participation, we saw an increase in young people involved in ICT or expressed a desire and interest to do work in the ICT sector. And that was literally because it demonstrated certain levels of wealth creation, or as it were, a sustainable livelihood, either at an individual level or part of the corporate entity. So if we discuss whether it's open data or agriculture or youth engagement without asking the question around profitability of the business, then I think we're doing a disservice to this young population that just doesn't want to exist, but wants to have better livelihood, and whatever that means in terms of today's socioeconomic profile of society. Now, what are the realities? The realities are that whether it's open or not open, the questions are three. How prepared are governments to implement open data? And that's a very big question. The other question is that what policies have been put in place to ensure that open data is a practice and it's not just the business of government? And then what is the impact this is having? I mean, somebody has argued to me that open data itself is a visionary aspiration for Africa. It's not even yet a question of actions, because our democratic practice or governance projections do not suggest that the nearest future African governments are willing to actually practice open data. Why? Issues of data corruption, issues and what information to give at what point in time, because you want to guard the practice of citizenship. Or there in regards to accountability of the public sector, to what extent is government willing to allow the population have access to correct data, which is used to hold them accountable to either political campaign promises or, as it were, the practice of good governance. But let me narrow down as I take you to a closing. Also, is the challenge of open data is beyond the issue of national security. Well, I wouldn't say beyond, but necessarily its impact on national security is being paid more attention to. And that brings to us the political context or the political analysis of the discourse. But then there's the business to it, the profitability issue around why people should have access to data. Whether that data is generated by government, or that data is generated by the academia, or that data is generated by people in the business of data. Now, if our government wants to diversify the economy, like take the cases of countries like countries where oil-producing countries, Nigeria, Angola, and co., you realize that if they do not pay attention to this, young people doing agriculture means nothing, because then you're going to produce and you can't sell. Let me wrap up by taking you to the premise for why we should take this more seriously beyond just talking about it in the conference. So after the Sustainable Development Goals meeting that happened in New York, or the adoption of the SDG goals, there was a global partnership for sustainable development data. And that came together and created something called the International Open Data Charter. This was launched after the SDGs, and then Africa responded by establishing African Data Consensus. I worked in African Union for 5 years. Before that, I was in the UN Population Fund. One of the biggest challenges we have on the continent is access to data. Data that is consistent, data that is collected periodically on time, and in fact, data that is responsive to the challenge of the continent is facing at any point in time. I find, for example, as a policy advisor on resources and partnerships, I couldn't find data to advise ministers and heads of government around the issues that Africa needed to make decisions around. After the conference in Addis Ababa in 2015, a couple of recommendations were made, and these are some of the key recommendations I want to put forward here in our reflection, so that this discourse here takes those conversations forward. Number one, that as far as data is concerned, there's a lot more focus on data security than data for business, or as it were, data that helps the private sector to do business profitably. Number two, that data collected by African governments belong to the people, and it is a right to have access to data. That the citizens across Africa should be able to access, understand, and engage with data. And that sustained investment in supporting and training a broad section of the non-state actors, civil society, young people, private sector, as entrepreneurs to understand and use data effectively. There's a huge gap. Contextualizing open data tools and approaches to local needs, for example, in making data visually available, accessible in countries with lower literacy levels. And then finally, that not just capacity building, but not just capacity building, how do you make governments themselves champions for open data? With this, I hope we'll have a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
4H is a youth development program that is in at least 50 countries all over the world. We are known as one of the largest youth development organizations that is run uniquely because each country program is run independently. So we don't have a headquarters that manages all 4H programs all over the world. Yes, the 4H program was begun 115 years ago in the United States of America, and it spread very fast during the colonial period to at least 70 countries. Today we have 50 active countries that independently and indigenously grow the growth of their movement within that country. And I'll just be sharing with you how we see the potential of growing the agricultural revolution through open data by sharing a few examples of how 4H has been able to do it. So, to give an example that we actually shared in the Daily Nation, if you have a copy of the Daily Nation on page 43, there's a good summary on the 4H programmatic approach on open data that was put out by our executive director, Anyaga. So I will begin by saying information is power, and it's no wonder that in this generation today, information is about one of the most expensive things that you can purchase, because it is linked to businesses and it's linked to a lot of money. So if you have information, you literally can control how food is processed, the cost of things, and in Kenya we are just struggling with what I would say is a shortage in maize production, and a lot of people will agree with me that a lot of information has a lot to do with the shortages we have in the market. So 115 years ago in the United States of America, somebody discovered that if you gave youth this very important tool, which is information, they could transform the economy. And 4H clubs started as just a form of way to transform how farmers applied technology to increase production in their farms. So young people, we all know, are very keen in adopting technology. So they were able to adopt technology and teach older farmers who were a bit apprehensive in adopting that technology to be able to transform how they were able to to practice agriculture. And that is an example of how when government and the public sector, who in today's world are in charge of the production, science and technology and engineering of the production system, also in charge of a lot of the development across the value chain. If they share information, they feed it back to organizations and programs like 4H, and that in turn empowers us to ensure that children are being given the right kind of skills and tools in agriculture that are responding to the challenges in the value chain. So if you're looking at the 13-year-old today who is supposed to be making decisions that are going to impact global food security by the year 2025, are we giving them the right skills? Are they understanding the challenges of food security and nutrition today? Because if you do not begin to envision the problem from the design stage, you're going to have a very difficult problem changing their focus once they've already been attracted to other more lucrative sectors.
I will talk a little bit on partnerships and SDGs and agricultural job creation for young people. I think a lot of countries today, especially in Africa, are aiming to move into middle income status, and that usually includes economic transformation. Yet we know that the majority of people are living in rural areas, the majority of people are engaged in agriculture, and we do know that job creation in agriculture in Africa still exceeds job creation in the modern sectors. So we need to understand that we have a demographic growth and a large proportion of the populations are young people. And yes, this is an opportunity, this is a dividend. But if we don't have the right policies, we will not be able if we don't direct the policies, we will not be able to reach the opportunities of the potential energy of young people. Young people today are facing a lot of challenges in accessing jobs. In rural areas, a lot of them are dropping out of school. Most of them don't have access to land. They enter the labor market without any skills or potential, employability, productivity. A lot of them were working children, so the transition from child labor to youth employment is a very important issue. So we have the SDGs today, and as international community working with the government, we have SDG 1 on alleviating poverty, and SDG 8 on economic growth, productive employment and decent work. So what can be done if we look at SDG 8 in particular? I think the international community right now is doing 3 things in this area. One is to ensure young people's transition to decent work. This includes skills development, employability skills, apprenticeship development, work-based training, entrepreneurship development, but mind you, not everyone is made to be an entrepreneur, so we need to take that with caution. And increasing productivity so they have access to decent work. So that is the transition, the supply side. On the demand side is ensuring that we have economic growth, but we all know very well that a lot of African countries, including Kenya, has experienced very high economic growth rates that were not inclusive, and that has not created the jobs needed. It was not inclusive growth. And the whole thing about SDGs is not to leave people behind.
I've a different approach to open data. Would it be also possible to have more sharing of information, not just data, but also approaches? How are people doing it? What are the best results with specific target groups? I think we need also transparency in that, not only the data, as such as numbers, but also the logic of the numbers? Thank you very much.
I pose this question to the first panelist, Emmanuel Mkini. You raised very valid questions regarding open data and government involvement. And my question is, do we have cases where governments have fully complied in terms of availing this data without, biasness or without any form of, lack of transparency? And what can we borrow then to effect this? Because I believe while government sometimes has this valid data, private sector sometimes does a better job in collecting the data. So is there a case that maybe you can tell us of what has been a success?
One of the highlights of the conference that was held in Addis Ababa 2 years ago was the result of the study conducted by the Open Data Barometer. And that study showed that in Africa, for example, showed that Africa, for example, is lagging behind other regions in the use and impact of open data. There are no sub-Saharan African countries that rank in the top 40, while there are about 6 countries from Africa that are in the bottom 10 of countries that rank the most in those 3 criteria as I mentioned earlier, their level of commitment to implement open data, the policies that are in place, and what impact it's having in terms of its usability. So we know that, for example, from the study that globally there is much work to be done. However, only 10% of the 1,380 data sets that were analyzed were open in the first place. And alarmingly, only 2 of these data sets were from Africa. So that's to tell you where Africa sits in terms of open data. And then again, around the transparency issue, there is the question of the politics of governance, the question always put forward, which is national security. So this data is being kept in this particular because of we're trying to protect national security. However, I think you raised a very important point, and this is an issue that's come up especially in academic conversations around open data, that the non-state actors, especially the private sector, are doing much better when it comes to collecting data, the quality of the data, the usability of the data, the relevance of that data, whether in terms of the algorithms that are being applied or in the questions that they are asked. And to what extent is government willing to maybe not give up completely, but regulate better that industry and allow people who do the business better to do it better? That is the question that I think hopefully this conference should be able to provide a recommendation around. Thank you.
What we are doing, for example, in 4H Kenya, is partnering with organizations to actually create that data and create the information and then sharing it. So we know that we had a drought across the region. 4H Kenya has 192 schools spread across close to 15 counties. So if we've partnered with Globe Kenya to collect information on soil temperature, weather patterns, literally everything. We're setting up weather stations in clubs. So as we collect that information, we can be able, and we're partnering with Globe Kenya, who have an agreement with the U.S. National Space Agency, because they need specific kind of information across the globe. So if we are able to relate that information that's being collected by the kids in their clubs, the kids are gaining useful information on applying science and all that, but we are also comparing it to the produce being produced by the farmers within the communities. Therefore, we become creators of information that was previously very difficult to trace. So I think that's one way of going about it. Identifying the kind of information and the gap that is there, and then creating innovative and inclusive ways of creating that data together.
One of the things that we're responding to around youth enterprise development and young people being able to do business in the agricultural value chain across other sectors is providing relevant intelligence advisory and tools around doing business in Africa. So how do they take part in the intra-Africa trade landscape by providing them access to information? One of the things that is clear is there's lack of harmonization across the continent when it comes to data. There's a lack of integration when it comes to data. And so how you even use that data within a country is already a problem, let alone imagine when you want to bring that data together at the continental level, which is the business that we do. And so we created this platform called Doing Business in Africa, and within that we have the advisory, the intelligence, the tools and instruments, and then information to say, for example, you want to open a business, an export business, the Youth Export Directory. And then we found that the export regime, for example, across different countries are very different. So you cannot really say if you're going to export, let's say you want to export maize out of Nigeria to Kenya or to the UK, there are certain standards you need to meet in terms of packaging, storage, that ensures the levels, that ensures that the product you're exporting meets the standards for the international market. The young person has no idea about that. He just goes, okay, there's maize package and sells and then gets returns. So that's a big challenge. So how do you provide the data for that person who wants to do business in Africa or outside of Africa to have data that is from 55 different countries? It's a nightmare to pull together in one platform. And so the question about is it useful, is it creating benefits, is not even a conversation yet. It's not yet the conversation. The conversation is how do we ensure that we have an harmonized regime of data collection that trickles down to what the practice of the National Bureau of Statistics to start with. And then we have what we call access to information bills or tools or policies in countries that ensures that beyond what the National Bureau of Statistics can do, that the private sector that actually sits with all this intelligence makes that data available in a regulated manner for those in the business of doing this or those who are in the enterprise of doing this business. This is my experience, and I don't know what others will say, but yeah.
I think we are in a transition in terms of availability of data. A third thing to answer on harmonization, I think this is a very, very important point. However, speaking as International Labour Organization, I'd like to say that for labor force data, it is definitely standardized, because to be able to have comparable data between countries, a lot of technical support is provided to the national levels to have common definitions, etc. The problem is it's not regular, it's not consistent, and it's not produced on time, and it's not shared. Now, sometimes you can share, and that is the other problem that you have, is what is our role in ensuring that people can use the data properly? And that is the issue of capacity building, knowledge development, so that people can use the data when